So I'm from British Columbia. And it's this time of year, it's very much like Stockholm, because most of the time it's a lot like Stockholm. We just have a few things that are different in my part of the world than there is in maybe your part of the world. This is a camera I call Animal Crossing. It's pointed from between my house and my neighbor's house. It's about 6 o'clock in the morning on a Wednesday, which in my town is garbage day. And so every Wednesday morning, if you put out your garbage early, there are consequences. So you do not put your garbage out early. This particular year in British Columbia, we had very bad forest fires. The rains have now come, so the forest fires are down. This was a photo my wife took. This is sunrise on Mars, basically. The whole city was covered in smoke. There was about 50,000 people at one point evacuated from the area in British Columbia. British Columbia is much larger than you realize. It's actually 4 times the size of California, which is also absurdly big, and it has about 4 million people in it. And 90% of them live within 100 kilometers of the southern border. So when you get up in the interior of British Columbia, it's about 1 person per 1,000 kilometers, and you don't want to meet that guy. He's up there for a reason. And yes, I make a lot of podcasts. Any .NET Rocks listeners? Oh, wow, I'm flattered. It's awesome. I did not start .NET Rocks. My friend Carl Franklin started it back in 2002, which means he predates the word podcast by 3 years. That's why we call it the Internet Audio Talk Show. We're coming up. I was the 3rd co-host, actually. So I was the first co-host was a fine Southern gentleman by the name of Mark Dunn, who actually convinced Carl that they really should make these things. And so they were just putting MP3 files on the internet, although eventually realized that most people were burning them onto CDRs, because this was 2002, and that's what you did, and they'd play them in their car. Mark did 50 shows with Carl, and then got too busy, moved on. And an interesting fellow by the name of Rory Blythe came on for the next 50. And Rory eventually joined Microsoft, and then got buried as well. And I was a guest on episode 69. And then we talked a lot about hardware and gadgets and things like that. So Carl asked me if I would do a bit on the show. Back then it was almost a 2-hour variety show. Had some music, had some comedy, and then I would do a bit called Richard the Toy Boy at the end. And I'd listen to the interview, and then I'd find a gadget that the guest would really, really like, and one that would horrify them. And then at the end of the show, we'd do the 2 gadgets. And so Carl asked me, I'd had some experience with radio. We collaborated on the show after that. And I realized that while the 2.5-hour variety show was really fun, the Venn diagram of folks who liked the whole thing versus folks who just wanted the silly and folks that just wanted the interview, they didn't intersect well. And so we split the show apart into a focused interview show that would be .NET Rocks. And we spun off all the fun stuff into a thing we eventually called Mondays. Any Mondays listeners? Okay, I'm really sorry. It took some serious turns for the worst. You know, like some people talk about stuff that's not safe for work, so I eventually called Mondays not safe for humans. And we haven't done near as many of those. We're up at, what, 1484 now for DNR as of this week. I started Run As Radio in 2007, and it's been every Wednesday since 2007, so a little over 500 of those now. So yeah, a lot of podcasts. We briefly had a show, briefly meaning 3 years, called The Tablet Show. In 2011, after the first Build conference in Anaheim, when Carl and I went to that show, and Microsoft didn't talk about .NET at their premier developer show for 3 whole days, and we came out of that show going, wow, we make a show called .NET Rocks. What if .NET doesn't rock anymore? And so this was our contingency plan, is that we made a show called The Tablet Show, and we'd talk about cross-platform development and things like that. And then .NET started to rock again, and so we eventually, after 3 years, rolled The Tablet Show into .NET Rocks and did them together. So I've talked to a lot of technology people over the years. We've done tons and tons of interviews. I was pretty sure I was only going to do 50 shows at .NET Rocks, because that's what the previous 2 co-hosts had done. I mean, Mark had done 50, and Rory had done 50. So I'll do 50. Missed it by a little bit. So I'm somewhere in the neighborhood of 2,000 episodes now. I also make conferences. My next one coming up in 2 weeks in Las Vegas is called Dev Intersection. And Mr. Guthrie will be there along with Mr. Hanselman and a bunch of other troublemakers. So if you have an urge to fly all the way across an ocean and a continent, we'd love to have you. And always a really fun show at the MGM Grand. I don't talk a lot about my business stuff most of the time these days. I've been involved in startup culture through the dot-com boom, and you hit a point where I'm more an investor advisor, done a lot of startup accelerators and things like that. And I lost interest in it a number of years ago. It got too weird. And then the Laudato Si came along. So Pope Francis, in his second encyclical about on the care of our common home, made this statement, this concept that capitalism and social conscience, or care for our common home, care for the earth, are not mutually exclusive, that we could be building profitable companies that are beneficial to the planet as well. And a group of VCs grabbed onto this idea and built the Laudato Si Challenge, and found a dozen companies, more actually, but they ended up bringing 9 of them to Rome this summer to run an accelerator specifically around capitalism with a social conscience. So I had the opportunity to be one of the first advisors to Laudato Si Challenge, and it really rekindled my enthusiasm for we can build companies that work throughout the world, that are profitable so they're sustainable, but are of net benefit to everyone, including the planet. Now, I'm an old guy. I actually wrote my first line of code in 1977, which is not the most important thing that happened in 1977. The most important thing that happened in 1977, Star Wars. All right, let's keep our priorities straight. I was 10 years old. This was a formative moment for me, but I liked the TIE Fighter more than I liked the lightsaber. That says a whole other thing about me necessarily. Now, that computer was a TRS-80 Model 1. It had 4K of RAM, a cassette tape player. That's actually a Star Trek game on the screen, 127 by 47 graphic resolution, and a version of BASIC not made by Microsoft. It was a tiny BASIC, and it only had 3 error messages. What? How? And sorry. Which I still think is the best error message ever. Because it's super honest. I mean, what is object not found but sorry? The nice thing is that back then it was all command line. You try to divide 1 by 0, it says sorry. What do you want to do now? Windows makes you agree that you're wrong. Object not found. Okay. I had a neighbor come to me one time and says, my computer says registry is corrupt. Okay. There's no not okay button. What do I do now? You have to agree your registry is corrupt before you get to do anything else. This was a friendlier time with computers, really. I was 10 years old. I mean, that's why Star Wars had such a serious impression on me. But I had already had that moment in that Radio Shack with that computer, being able to do something with it. And I went back to that Radio Shack almost every day after that. The store owners didn't mind, because if a 10-year-old kid can make that computer do that thing, they can convince an executive, you should own one of these. All right, so I discovered my superpower really early. I just got lucky. I've never done anything else. I fell into computing as a child, and I grew up with it. And somewhere along the way, it became a profession of sorts. And I had the good fortune being relatively articulate and excited and experienced. I was just a bit ahead of everyone else. So I ended up in performance tuning, mostly because I had a strong hardware background, built a lot of my own equipment. I learned networking from the beginning. I was a certified netware installer at like 17 years old. I watched Chris Date actually do presentations on why relational databases are going to be a good idea. And so when you're comfortable with databases, and you're comfortable with networking, you're comfortable with how hardware works, figuring out websites is pretty easy. And so performance tuning became this nice niche that I fell into, and I pretty much got to travel the world on the back of that. I started picking and choosing work based on it was a country I hadn't been to yet. Because there's always more work than you could do. Right? My view on software and technology development was based on the number of no's per week I had to say. Because you can't do everything. You say no to the stuff that's not important to you, and you get more of the stuff that is. It was the hardest thing in the world I learned, was to turn down work I really didn't want to do. Turn down customers that I didn't enjoy working with. Because amazingly, the side effect of the no was a yes to stuff that really mattered, and so more of that appeared. And so I traveled extensively. I've worked all over the planet. I think I'm at 95 countries now. I'll have to go back and look. It's getting harder to find new ones. And the crazy thing is that having visited 95 countries, I'm still at less than half. There's a lot of country out there. There's a lot of world out there. It's a big planet. There's lots to see. And once your bills are paid, once you've taken care of your family, once you're doing those things and you're working on stuff that you enjoy working on, you need more. You've got to look more broadly at the opportunities you have in front of you. We are so fortunate to be in this industry where there is so much opportunity. In some ways, I think we get a little lazy. We don't have to try that hard. We're very well paid. The return on investment of software is extraordinary. When we get it right, we don't make things 10% better. We make them tenfold better. If you're a sales director and you put it on your mission working at a company that you're going to increase sales for the company by 10%, and you make that goal, you've knocked it out of the park. That's the trip to Bermuda and the promotion, like it's huge. We routinely write software that improves productivity by 10 times. We never go to Bermuda. Now, one of the reasons I think that is that we rarely take on the return on investment commitment. Often, because we enjoy the problem so much, because we like working on these things, they have a tough time taking us that seriously, actually. Even though we do that productivity, we don't take it from a business perspective, own the responsibility to create those kinds of improvements. I think we'd do better if we did, but it's not like we're suffering. For a long time, people complained that the rate of successful software delivery was so low, 50%, 40%. Now, most projects eventually get done. They tend to be over time and over budget. That may be estimation problems. That might be requirements problems. There's many reasons why over time and over budget. But ultimately, when we deliver the software, the value is so high that it doesn't really matter that it took longer or costed more. The ROI always pays back. And we're getting better. And I think we've plucked a lot of the easy fruit now that we actually have to work harder to show good yields and be more efficient. I think we're becoming more of a profession than we've ever been before. I worked all over the Caribbean for many years building data centers for offshore banks because there's lots of money in it. Right? That's why when they asked John Dillinger, the bank robber, why he robbed banks, he says, that's where the money is. I ended up in fintech because it paid well. And it's very tough to do work in these remote locations, bad connectivity, limited resources, limited power, poor cooling. So we built data centers. So I got really familiar with hurricanes. If you're going to build data centers in the Caribbean, you got to learn how to build them to resist hurricanes. And the answer is, you're not going to be able to resist hurricanes. Ask me how I know. I tried very hard. And the first time I saw computing really come to the forefront of disaster response was Katrina. So that's 2006. And in 2005. And this is a photo of the Ninth Ward shortly after the hurricane had passed by. And it's bad enough, the flooding, but if you really look close, it's just the sheer amount of oil moving across, moving into people's yards, moving into people's basements. I think about what's happening in Houston right now after Hurricane Harvey, which was not an especially powerful hurricane, but pulled a lot of water out of the Gulf of Mexico and dropped it on that city. And there's huge petrochemical plants all around Houston, many of which caught fire or broke down. The sheer amount of ethylene and benzene that's in the water as these flooding is retreating from Houston, the ecological damage is hard to even conceive of. What was exciting to me about Katrina is we started seeing developers pop up and write code to help. Now, it's 2005, so the iPhone doesn't exist yet, the cloud doesn't exist yet. This was literally borrowed computers and writing software on the fly to help people. There's lots of different things you could do. I mean, a hurricane is a terrifying thing, even with an evacuation order. And one of the biggest things that happened back then was that you weren't allowed to bring your pet with you. Now, this caused a lot of people to stay because they weren't prepared to leave their pets behind. But in many cases, they left, and the pets had to survive on their own, which made the pets are actually pretty resilient if you don't tie them to anything. they'll probably make it. And now we had to locate all these pets. I met a fellow who wrote the software to find and coordinate lost pets. So disaster response workers traveling into the damaged areas of Katrina were taking photos of the animals they were finding when they were pulling them out, and they were being posted up to a website so that folks that had been evacuated could locate their pet. Pet Finder app. Great concept. And relieved a lot of stress. Since then, the rules have changed that you are allowed to bring your pets with you because it's simply a human survival thing. If people refuse to leave in a disaster, an evacuation like that because of their pet, just bring the pet. Besides, who wants to torment a dog or a bird or any other thing? It's terrible. Now, the downside is, not that Katrina ever really ended, because there's parts of the Ninth Ward and parts of New Orleans that still haven't recovered. But as the disaster wound down, a lot of that software got lost. It was borrowed hardware and borrowed development resources. And the fellow that I was talking to that built this software, he'd actually written it 3 times now. Because then the next disaster would come along and they needed it again. And he couldn't find the last one and the old hardware's gone. And so he just write it again. I mean, he got better at it. He got faster, but it wasn't a particularly efficient use of time. And it made me really think about this concept of sustainability. Sustainable software. Look, we know the technology can do it. I've been consulting with development teams for 20 years now, and I don't have the question, can the technology do it? My question is always, can this team do it? In a lot of respects, I'm more marriage counselor than anything else. The question is always, what are the challenges that this team has for us to get to the deliverables that we're after? It's not a technical problem so much. Sustainability has more to do with how do we care and feed software over time? Do we still know how to build it? Do we still know how to deploy it? Are you willing to make a change into that chunk of code that we have the big skull and crossbones around? Here there be dragons. That guy quit 2 years ago and he was a genius. I'm not going in there. You've met code like this. Sustainable code should always be buildable, always deployable, have good tests around it so we're able to manage it. And that was the problem you had with this disaster response code. Because it was only lit up in a disaster, it got rusty, it got neglected, and it became easier in the adrenaline rush of the disaster to write it again than it was to sustain it from one event to the next. That happens a lot. I mean, the number of times I've run into organizations where they're just going to rewrite it. Right? The argument about trying to sustain the existing application versus actually just writing a new version. Because you've lost the skills. We've lost the mind around what that project was actually about. And it speaks to one of the strengths of open source. Now, open source does not necessarily have these high ideals about long-term sustainability. It's almost a side effect. Most open source projects are built by developers for developers. You're building a tool to help you be more productive on something, and you put it in a shareable place. You put it in GitHub. And others see your project and find it useful for their work and find some piece missing from it that they need for the things they're doing, and so they contribute to it. It's very egalitarian. And it creates a social construct. It's sort of, I have friends who on their bucket list is have an accepted pull request into the Linux kernel, which apparently is not easy to do. But I see that. I think we've got folks out there now who are like, you know what I'd really like? I'd like to have a piece of my code in the C# compiler. Like you could get there now. Right? That's a side effect of open source. This social construct around source code. And also an acknowledgement that source code's not the asset. I'm an old school developer. I used to believe the code I wrote was the valuable thing until I didn't want to maintain it anymore. Then I didn't feel like I valued it at all. And I remember customers demanding of me, I want to copy the source code, so I would print it out for them and bring it to them. Here you go. Enjoy. You don't know what you have. You don't know what's actually valuable. Then sustainable, buildable, reliable source code, reliable applications, they're a lot more than the code. And so open source creates a construct around this idea that we can put code in a place where it's more likely to be sustained, given its importance. And it also opens the door to a lot of other capabilities beyond that. I'm probably in one of the very few rooms in the world where I can talk about open source like an insider's game, where most of us have spent time on an open source project, know what GitHub is, know that relationship to code and why you would deal with it. When you talk to the greater world about open source, they find it completely insane. Like, let me get this straight. You're a software developer. You put in an 8-hour day at work, writing code all day. Like, well, there are meetings, but yes. And then at night, you go home and you write code for free. Yes, and I like it more. That seems nutty. Why would you do that? Now, the best explanation of that mindset and this information work, or this modern work and mindset as a whole, I found in a book by Daniel Pink called Drive. And I hope you've read it. If you haven't, put it on your list. It's worth your time, because he really breaks down these ideas around what actually motivates us. And he goes straight to this, we want to believe, and certain business people still believe in this, as long as I have the carrot of income in front of you, you'll do whatever I want. Dance, monkey boy, dance. And he knows it's simply not true, and you certainly know it's true. We've had employers offer us more money, and we don't want it. We're looking for other things from work. I think it's true of virtually everyone today, just because of the nature of how work's evolved. That when work was essentially manual, when it was about digging a hole, that money was a useful incentive. But once the money reaches a certain point, once we've got our bills paid, once you're not worried about making the rent, incentives change. And in Drive, there was 3 key elements he talked about. One was autonomy. Autonomy is easy to get your head around, because autonomy says, I want to work the way I want to work. Tell me what the goal is, and I'll work to that goal. To be able to pick a programming language, to be able to pick a library, to be able to pick a feature you want to contribute to be able to select your hours, just make the deadline. That's autonomy. How do I have the freedom to work the way I want to work, deliver the things that are valuable to the organization? I don't think anyone wrestles with autonomy. We would all like more autonomy. As a leader of developers, I'm looking to how do I provide more autonomy to my people? Because when I do, they're more productive and they're happier. They want to stay. They want to continue to contribute. Next up is mastery. The mastery is a weirder concept, especially for folks that are not in the kind of work that we do. Mastery speaks to this idea that no piece of software, no craft, no creation is perfect or finished. James Joyce said, art is never finished, only abandoned. Right? That's pretty much like software. I still want to work on it, but you're taking it away from me because of something called deployment? Why? Why would you do that? I love that software. The worst thing I could do is finish it, then it goes away. But that's the nature of mastery, that we are supposed to finish things and that we want to press against the edges of our skills. And it speaks to another aspect of this style of intellectual work, where often when we're dealing with people that don't understand what we do, they want to put us in a box. You're a front-end dev, so we'll get you doing front-end stuff for the rest of your life. You're a back-end dev. It's web API for you. How about some Node? Just keep making more, right? You're just a cog in the machine. They want to put you in place, and that's not what we want to do. We want to explore. We want to press against our skills. That's why we say things like, I can build that in 3 weeks. I just need the book. And how many times is we found that the only way to improve our mastery of a skill was to change jobs, to go somewhere else, and to add something a little aspirational to our resume. Oh yes, I have 15 years of Connect development experience. I'll figure it out, right? I'll put the mask on, I'll fake it till I make it, because it's kind of the only way. But here we are in an event clearly aimed at mastery, that we want to press against the edge of our skills, want to expand our thinking. And so again, our drive the animus around why we do this, what we look for in a place that we love to work in or something we want to work on, is that it presses against those things, that it makes us think more broadly, that it pushes our capabilities further. Change the language, change the tooling, change the scope of the project. And the third aspect, purpose. Are we working for something more than a paycheck? Startups have got this nailed, right? That's what made startups hip, was always this: we're working to a greater good. I'm looking to completely reduce the element of privacy for the entire world. I think that's Facebook's message, isn't it? Okay, well. But there are higher purposes, and I mentioned Laudato Si earlier because there is this idea that we have businesses that do more, that can actually contribute to the greater good as well as be profitable. That we recognize that profit isn't a motivation unto itself, that there's more. That profit is what makes doing good work sustainable over time. And so knowing what that purpose is, commuting that purpose well, you call it a vision if you want. Call it a mission statement if you want. It doesn't really matter. Define it in a way that we speak to doing something more than just, I'm just looking to see if you're typing today, because then I know you're working. Because thinking, who would want that in programming? That's just crazy talk. But these three elements, autonomy, mastery, purpose, that's how I explain open source to mortals. Right? Why? Why would you code at night after coding all day? Because autonomy, mastery, purpose. That's why. And that's what got me thinking about charitable work around software. It was knowing those three things, knowing the need for sustainability, knowing the need that open source can facilitate. Plus some technological elements, the cloud. Now, it's easy to say the cloud is just other people's computers, because let's face it, it is. Combined with virtualization, I mean, cloud is as much an architecture as it is hardware, right? The architecture that allows applications to travel freely where they need to travel, to scale as necessary, and for you to only pay as needed. I mean, what's a better workload that needs dynamic scaling than disaster response? It's a disaster. We need a lot for a while, and then we need to be able to dial it back, because we don't need as much anymore. And I think the stressors you're seeing right now around cloud, the conflict, concerns about Google's power and Facebook's power, is an acknowledgement that this is becoming truly a utility. Once upon a time, centuries ago, actually not that long ago, just over 100 years ago, a non-trivial amount of our time as adult humans was focused on water. Safe drinking water for your family, because it was up to you to get water each day. And gradually recognizing that that's a huge time sink, as our civilizations advanced, we created plumbing and water treatment plants and specialists in caring for water. We made them part of our government so that we didn't have to think it anymore. In fact, that's why we now talk about unimportant software as plumbing. I don't want to work on plumbing. No, nobody wants to work on plumbing. That's why we have specialists, so that we know the water coming out of our tap is safe. And then when we flush the toilet, it goes somewhere that's not going to poison us. We have a group of utilities today. Electricity we consider a utility. We talk about internet as a utility, but I think the pain that we're going through right now, the concerns around privacy and security, is about building a set of regulations to treat compute as the utility that it ultimately needs to be, as our plumbing. And plumbing needs to be regulated. You need to know it's safe. So it seems odd right now, it seems fearful right now, and we can be Luddites and pull back. Let's not do that, let's do it ourselves. But when I hear that, I think, I really don't want to have to get buckets of water out of the stream anymore that I need to run computers. It's the same basic concept. This is the next stage in our civilization, and it opens the door to a lot of potential work. More things that we could do, that we can focus on the things that are important, because running this stuff, while important, it can be done by specialists in a regulated way that gives us confidence that it'll do what we need to at the time. Now, the other important aspect is the mobile revolution. Now, I don't buy into the death of a PC because as far as I'm concerned, this is a personal computer also. I mean, what's more personal than a computer you keep in your pocket and get really upset when you can't find? What's more personal than a computer you're concerned might give you cancer? That's a pretty personal computer. And we forget how powerful these machines actually are. What's this? Warp drive for the Enterprise? No, that's this. That's a Cray XMP supercomputer circa 1985. This is one of the most powerful computers in the world in 1985. It was about $16 million. It was cooled with mineral oil, consumed 200 kilowatts of power, and it held a whole 1.9 gigaflops of processing power. They modeled nuclear explosions with this computer. Compare that to this, the iPad 2, circa 2011. So 26 years later, for $800, 1.9 gigaflops of processing power that you play Candy Crush with. And that thing's 6 years old now. So I think it's useful that we remind ourselves that we're carrying supercomputers around. This is now normal. We have this digital extension to ourselves. We are cyborgs. We are digitally enhanced. We keep it outside the body because, ew. And it complicates upgrades anyway, right? So, but the fact, the physical reaction that people have to losing these devices is your proof. It's a limb. It's as personal gets. And it's changed our social constructs. My daughter's I always had a smartphone, even when they were ugly and dumb, I had a smartphone. The daughters eventually want them once the iPhone revolution came along, and I gave them to them pretty quickly. And it annoyed the wife because they were on them all the time, especially at the dinner table. We were going to make a rule. So I resisted making the rule. Instead, I got the wife an iPhone. And then we were all at the phone on the table. I changed the social norm, which is interesting, right? Something is compelling in a society when we modify our social behaviors to tolerate it. And you think of the impact this has had. The number of people it's killed because they walked in front of a bus. That is not a problem you found with a lot of other technology. I think it's the definition of a limb. This can kill you. Must be a limb. But that combination of open source with its autonomy, mastery, and purpose, cloud, and mobile devices is what shaped Humanitarian Toolbox. So the idea is simple: open source software for disaster relief organizations. Now, when I started back in 2012, Carl and I were doing a road trip across the United States. We've done this a few times. We rent an RV from some unsuspecting people who don't understand what we're about to do to their RV. It's the new launch of Visual Studio. In this case, it was the 2012 launch. And so we literally drove all the way across the United States, down the Eastern Seaboard, and back. 34 cities in 13 weeks, 5 shows a week. It's not the job my high school counselor ever told me I'd have. It's a ton of work, but a lot of fun. Meet a lot of people. Got logos all over the RV. But they asked me if we would have a charitable component to the tour, and I went on a rant. And I have the notes from that rant about how difficult it was for software developers to contribute their capabilities to charity. And I've seen it done many times. I mean, there's give camps where folks get together, where an organization will pick a few charities that are local, and folks will get together and spend a weekend, typically putting together a brochure or a website. And sometimes you get hooked on that charity. That's the best thing that could possibly happen. You have this superpower. You have this skill to make computers sing and dance for you. You found a charitable organization that speaks to you. You spend time with them. You use that skill to benefit them. Awesome. Great thing to do. Give camps sometimes come out that way. And sometimes it's an adrenaline and caffeine-fueled weekend. And, even when you write software for free, software's never free. Software is free the same way a puppy's free. And the charity has to live with the puppy. So how do we get sustainable software in a volunteer-driven way? And the important part there was to allow the developers to do the development and somebody else take responsibility for the detail work, for the project management, and for the sustainability. Now, I thought this was such a good idea, I started looking online for it, because every good idea has already been done, and didn't really find any equivalent. I saw a few organizations more at the government level that were trying to build software this way. I saw a non-trivial number of them that are trying to profit from it, which I find a little repugnant. And I found a lot of adrenaline-fueled development. Folks that got together over the course of a disaster to write what was needed at the time and then go again. And so I started spending some time with some of these charities to try and understand the work that they were doing and how they were working. And I learned, I'm pretty good at software development. I've worked with a lot of teams, but learning to be a charity, that's hard. But one of the things I found talking to the charity folks, the good ones, the disaster response folks that are really serious, is they're only focused on one thing: outcomes, not outputs. It's an interesting way to think about software too, right? An output is lines of code. An outcome is a working feature. We want outcomes, actually. And in disaster response, that's really clear. You can put a lot of volunteers on the ground, but have you saved any lives? Have you restored any homes? Those are outcomes. We don't want outputs. Outputs are a necessary byproduct. We're after outcomes. An example of this, talking to some great charities, one of them was Doctors Without Borders. Now, oddly enough, they have a lot of doctors. They also have a portable hospital system that in a major disaster site, they will bring that hospital in with its own cooling and heating and power and all the equipment to do surgeries, set of doctors, nurses, everything they need. It's a phenomenal setup. If you're looking for charity to give to, I absolutely recommend these guys. They're extraordinary. They do a tremendous amount of work. But in a disaster response scenario, while the trauma care side makes perfect sense, it's much more challenging to coordinate the teams of people necessary to explore a site. So a typical coordination team, when you're working on a site, covers many different skill sets. You need a certain amount of able-bodied folks that can do the sandbagging, do the heavy lifting. You need an engineer that can do structural assessments. You need a disaster worker that can deal with fatalities, the markup, identification of bodies. You need doctors to help with injured folks. It takes a coordination of skills. And a response a coordinator, somebody on the ground in a major site, will put together these teams. And no more than 20 years ago, the typical major disaster site, a hurricane site, anything like that, you'd have a half a dozen organizations that would arrive. Today, because of social media and the expansion of charity as a whole, there could be 200 organizations that arrive on a site. Organizing all those people is very challenging, and it's largely done with whiteboards and notebooks. Post-it notes, just trying to organize all of the information. This is an actual response site. If you look closely, you'll see it's in Japanese because this is the Fukushima coordination site. I got photos from inside of there. So paper-driven. And talking to relief workers, and when we've been trying to test our software, they will say things to us like, how does this beat pen and paper? Because I like the battery life of paper. Okay? And the resolution, too. So it's not an easy thing to do. This problem became one of our very first projects, a project called the Check-in Service. So we worked with the National Voluntary Organization Active in Disasters, building a piece of software that ran in the cloud, worked from phones, that allowed the volunteers to identify themselves to the coordinator early with the organizations they're with, when they were going to be on the ground, what skills they had, what groups they were working with. And then while they're out in the field, be able to collect data and feedback what was available and help the coordination site get things organized. I hope you're not terribly impressed with the complexity of software, because it's not terribly complicated software. And by the way, we need UX folks. A lot of developers working on the software, and it looks like it. Getting this stuff out to the field is very challenging. The ENVOAD, FEMA, those types of organizations will allow us to bring the software to their disaster trials. So they'll simulate an earthquake, say, in Los Angeles. And this is an opportunity for them to test fire, police, ambulance, disaster response groups, volunteer groups, make sure they can communicate effectively. They know their practices. They know all the systems that are available. And so we'll get into a test bed there and trial with them for a while and pretty much get our butts kicked. But good feedback. You know, one of the challenges with trying to be doing agile development in an environment like that is they only do a few of these trials a year, so you can't iterate that fast. But we're making good progress. We've been on the ground a few times with them now. In dealing with a serious disaster like a hurricane, it's kind of amazing to think, folks ask me, well, why do you want to worry about the cloud and the phone? Nothing could possibly be working. And you'd be mistaken. Cellular networks are remarkably resilient. In fact, they're never working perfectly. I think we've all had that experience. But they're never entirely broken either. And I don't want to say anything bad about cell, because we're kind of at the home of where a lot of cellular technology started. I mean, Ericsson's headquartered here. About a third of all cell technology in the world runs out of there. And we tend to think about it just from our use of devices, but in a disaster response event, even if it is broken, often the towers survive. They're mounted in concrete, they have their own generators, they'll keep functioning. But there's also portable towers. And in fact, one of the first initiatives for first responders is to deploy towers like this at a site. For the simple reason that in an environment like this, anywhere you can find a phone, you'll probably find a person who needs some help. So it actually improves the efficiency of the disaster relief worker to be able to triangulate phones. By the way, you only get 24 hours, so be quick. Batteries run down fast. And so they'll stand those towers up, run them on generator, get the signals, locate the phones, and then the relief workers have access from there on out. The cloud is hugely important in this scenario as well, again, from a sustainability perspective. You're not writing custom software for custom infrastructure. You're writing it for a common infrastructure. You can run it anywhere. HTBox, we run all our source code out of GitHub, but we can deploy out to Azure anytime we want. And in fact, the Microsoft reaction to that was to set up Microsoft Philanthropies, public cloud for public good. AKA, how much cloud would you like? We started out writing software to just try and help let people run it. Now we're sort of in a place where we're just running it on their behalf, because it turns out we're better at that too. I have lots of good, experienced cloud techs who can keep the system running for them so they don't have to think about that. I'd rather have the relief worker working on the ground with the skills they've got and our software helping them. We'll worry about the back end stuff. Talk about another project. This is one we started back in 2015 as part of the Studio 2015 launch, the project called Already. We worked with the American Red Cross on this particular project. The concept's pretty straightforward. Again, mobile and cloud. In this case, it's more preventative. So the particular scenario for the Red Cross was installing smoke detectors in homes that need them. So smoke detectors are cheap. Lots of places don't have them, they don't work anymore. The only skill part about a smoke detector is knowing where to put it in a house that'll actually keep people safe. There's a program you can take to know how to do that. Lots of construction folks and volunteer firefighters take that class and are happy to volunteer the time. All we have to do is organize them. And if there's anything I've learned over the past few years of doing charitable work like this, using volunteer time well is the most important thing you can do. And so Already was really about doing that coordination. So in the old days, they would do a smoke detector drive by setting up stands in home improvement centers, right? Your average Home Depot or Lowe's or even an IKEA for that matter. And saying, do you need a smoke detector? Sign up here. And they would take names and addresses down, and after they'd got enough of them together, they would sort them out on a map and then contact volunteers, give them a stack of smoke detectors to try and get them installed. And the success rate was roughly 20%. Typically, weeks have gone by, people forget, strange men knocking at your door is not always welcome, especially in America. And so getting some automation around this, being able to use GIS data, being able to use social media, allowed us to shorten up that iteration time. Using mobile apps, or really mobile web, to be able to use the volunteers' time more effectively, we got that success rate up to about 75%. So we use the volunteers' time better, and we got more smoke detectors installed. And I hope you get an impression that this is software that can be used for a lot of different things. One of my main initiatives right now for me personally is to get other charities using this software. I love the Red Cross. I love the things they're doing. They're all over the world. I've worked with the Norwegian Red Cross and the Swedish Red Cross as well. And they each have their own projects, and we talk about different ideas. But this is something that this piece of software could be used for all kinds of scenarios in terms of getting volunteers in the places where people need them. All right? Think about first aid classes, flood preparedness, forest fire preparedness, earthquake preparedness, all of these sorts of things where there's people who are qualified to do those assessments, just use their time well. This is a tool to help you organize those folks and get it out there. And again, we're not just giving it away, letting you, I mean, it's on GitHub. If you want to download a copy and take it out for a spin, I can't stop you, nor do I want to. But we're actually at a point now where it's like, can I operate that for you? It's multi-tenanted and white labeled. We can make it look any way you want, deploy it any way you want, and get your volunteers doing their thing. Now, I'm a Canadian working with a lot of Americans, for better or worse. And so I've pushed myself very hard and pushed our organization hard to not be US-centric. It's easy to fall into that trap. And so I try and keep an eye on the world. If you look at, does this map look weird? You're used to this map, aren't you? This is a Mercator map, right? This is a map built in the 1500s for navigators because it has consistent latitudes. But it does some weird things to the world. Greenland is enormous. It's the size of South America, and that is incorrect. Greenland is tiny. And Africa doesn't look that big, and Africa is the second largest continent on this planet. This is a Peters projection map. And I recommend it to you because what it does is does area rule over the land masses, so the land masses are the right size. So the reason it looks weird is you're not used to seeing that Africa is as big as Africa is. And Greenland is as small as it should be. It's just sort of a reality, and I have to remind myself every time to think about the world this shape rather than the shape that I learned in school. So we started taking Humanitarian Toolbox on the road, running codathons. So I call it a codathon rather than a hackathon. Hackathons imply a prize and that I want hackers. And I don't really have either or want either. A codathon is an opportunity to write code on a project that we're currently working on. So unlike most open source projects where contributions come from people who have a better idea of how to build something, we're working with the NGO. We have a set of work items. We are planning out what needs to be built next based on what the organization actually needs, and we represent them in GitHub as issues. And so you can pick up that issue and run with it. All right, have a conversation with us first, please. We don't like people writing code without being certain they're going in the right direction. But other than that, it's wide open to contribute to. And so the reason I run codathons is that it gets new people introduced to the project. We typically have 15 to 30 people come to an event like that. We provide them pizza because that works on everybody. It's like the universal food. And spend a weekend writing some code. My goal is always to get a couple of pull requests from every contributor. And with any luck, get a new addict. That out of any given group of 20 people, one person will fall in love with the project, whatever project that may be, will continue to contribute. And so late last year, we went to Eindhoven. That was our first outside of the US and Canada. We've done many in the US and Canada. Early this year in London, and then this summer in Sydney, which was actually their winter, because that's the logical thing for me to do is go to the Southern Hemisphere in winter. And less than a month ago here in Stockholm, had a group of people and did some contributions to already, including had a couple of the Microsoft guys who originally worked on the project in 2015 make contributions. And at this point, it's about 147 contributors. I just checked on GitHub before I built the slide deck. 3,300 check-ins, over 1,000 accepted pull requests. So it is a large group of contributors. And one of the things I like, if you look at the stats on the GitHub project for already, you'll see that there's no messiah. You know what I mean? Like most open source projects are built around an individual, and that individual is the primary contributor, and you typically contributes more than just about anybody else by a long way. And then you may have a few disciples around them that are significant contributors as well. If you look at this project, you'll find the top 10 all have 100 to 200 contributions. And they all came more or less from the same place, that they were at a codathon, they enjoyed working on the project a lot, and they kept contributing to it. And we get a couple of check-ins, every day. It's just an ongoing project. I want to pick on one particular person on this board. Let's see if I can make, oh, there it is. That's Steve Gordon. Let me tell you about Steve Gordon. Early on in Already's life, late 2015, we got a check-in from the UK, kind of out of the blue. I was surprised. We were just in the early days trying to figure out what we were doing exactly. And here was this check-in out of the blue. He was a .NET Rocks listener. We talked about it on .NET Rocks. He studied the project and found a way to make contributions, and that was cool. And we do a Google Hangout every other week on the Saturday. And so he was showing up to the Google Hangout and so on. When the Norwegian Developers Conference, NDC, asked me if I would do Codeathon in London, at the NDC London, I thought, that's an awesome idea. Okay, we're going to do this. We talk about it, got everything organized. NDC contributed to lunches in the space and so forth, very generous of them. And I was going to get Bill Wagner and I were going to be there, and we would invite folks it was free to go to. And so Steve really wanted to go. It's like, I'd love to meet you guys. I've been contributing to the project. Happy to be a part of it. I'm like, love to have you there. But it was on a Monday, Tuesday, and so he was literally going to take days off of work to go to this. And his boss didn't want to let him go because he's a good developer, and they needed his work done. And he was on Slack. He's as a regular contributor. We invite you onto the Slack channel, so he was contributing to the project. And so he pinged me, and he says, I'm really sorry, I can't go. And I'm like, well, why can't you go? He says, my boss doesn't want to give you days off. And I'm like, you got to pitch this better. This is a team-building opportunity. He really, should be setting the whole team up. Like, there's a huge potential here to, the challenge of any development team is that you've got to build trust, and trust is hard to build when you're doing the work day in, day out. I mean, I would argue that the only time you can build trust in an average work day is lunchtime. Really. You can challenge trust at work, but lunch is when we're human. That's when you actually get to talk to people. Plus, our brains are hardwired to trust people we break bread with. In fact, it's one of my great gauges when I'm coming into an organization as a consultant. If I invite two teams to lunch and they don't want to go to the same lunch, that's really a problem. That's not a happy team. So Steve and I went back and forth for a few times. And finally, I'm like, would you like me to talk to the CTO? Because I'm a charming guy. Anyway, 20 minutes of talking to the CTO, and now the Magix is paying for the entire team to go as a team-building exercise. They'll pick up the costs. No team. And he's like, how did you do that? Well, you got to talk about it the right way. Well, what do I know about CTOs, having been a CTO? I know that my biggest problem is making a stronger team. So as soon as I'm talking about how I strengthen a team, and why would working on this code make a better team? Because autonomy, mastery, purpose. It's no longer under a deadline. It's a volunteer thing. So that threat's taken away. We're using new tools. Want to press against the edges of your skills? Here's a project. And purpose? I'm here saving lives. Would you like to help? And so the whole team came up, spent the 2 days, had a great time together, strengthened that team, and wrote some good code. The kicker is they went back down, and further conversations with the CTO, they started running their own codeathons. They do one a quarter. And they invite the public. If you want to be a part of our project, our team of 6 are going to be working on this. These are the milestones we're currently contributing to, and you're welcome to join. And that's when they also discovered phenomenal recruiting tool. Why wouldn't you want to work for a company that values autonomy, mastery, and purpose? So it's a triple win. Stronger teams, exploring new skills, building larger teams, and writing software that makes a difference. It's the superpower. We forget, because we do it every day. We have a superpower. We just should do super things with it, and I hope you will too. Thank you for your time.